28 and a general. Must be cosplay. The cops howled with laughter as they tied Alexandra Kane to a tree in the town square. Townsfolk whispered mocking her as a joke, no one believing a young woman could claim the title of general. But Alexandra only smiled coldly. In 5 minutes, you'll believe. And then the ground shook, armored vehicles, rows of soldiers flooding in, as the entire town froze at the thunderous roar, "Salute General Kane." Before all that, though, Alexandra stood alone in the dim light of a border town's evening, her boots crunching on the gravel outside the police station. She'd been on her way to a quiet meeting just passing through when the patrol car screeched up. 2 officers jumped out, their faces, hard eyes narrowed. They didn't ask questions. They didn't wait for answers. They saw her plain field jacket, her unstyled hair, her bare face, and decided she didn't belong. "You're coming with us," one growled, grabbing her arm. She didn't resist. Her hands stayed steady even as the cuffs clicked tight. The older cop, his badge glinting under the streetlight, smirked as he shoved her into the car. "What's with the outfit, kid? You think you're in some war movie?" Alexandra didn't answer. She looked out the window, her gaze catching on a faded diner sign across the street, its neon flickering like a memory of her father's voice. "Hold your ground. Always." A street lamp flickered above the station, casting jagged shadows as Alexandra was led inside. The desk sergeant, a wiry man with a permanent scowl, tossed her bag onto the counter like it was trash. He rifled through it, pulling out a small worn notebook. "What's this, your diary?" He sneered, flipping it open. A photo slipped out, an old Polaroid of Alexandra, barely a teenager, standing beside a man in a general's uniform, his hand on her shoulder. The sergeant snorted, tossing the photo aside. "Nice prop. You borrow that from a costume shop." The other cops chuckled, one mimicking a salute. Alexandra's eyes flicked to the photo, her fingers twitching in the cuffs, but her face stayed still like a lake before a storm. The sergeant leaned closer, his breath sour. "You're not fooling anyone, sweetheart. This ain't Hollywood." She didn't blink, her gaze sliding past him, fixed on the wall, where a clock ticked too loudly. Inside the station, the air smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. The cops pushed her into a chair, her bag hitting the floor with a thud. A younger officer, his uniform crisp but his sneer lazy, leaned over the desk. "So, what's your deal? You lost or something?" He flipped through her papers, tossing them aside like junk mail. Alexandra sat straight, her hands cuffed behind her, her eyes locked on a crack in the wall. She didn't flinch when the older cop, his gut straining against his belt, laughed. "A general? Ha! 28 and a general. Must be cosplay." The room erupted, the other officers joining in, their voices bouncing off the concrete walls. A woman in a clerk's uniform poked her head in, chuckling. "She's probably one of those kids who watches too many war movies." Alexandra's fingers curled slightly, but her face stayed calm, her breath even. She didn't need to speak. Not yet. The clerk lingered, her nails tapping the counter, her eyes scanning Alexandra like she was a puzzle that didn't fit. "You know," she said, her voice syrupy with fake concern, "you shouldn't play games like this. People might think you're crazy." She pulled out Alexandra's military ID, holding it up to the light like it was a fake dollar bill. The older cop grabbed it, squinting. "Look at this, General Alexandra Kane." What a joke. He tossed it to the younger officer, who caught it and laughed. "Bet she printed this at the library." Alexandra's lips parted just enough to speak. "You've just made a very big mistake," she said, her voice low, steady, like a blade sliding from its sheath. The room went quiet for a split second. Then the younger cop snorted. "Listen to her. The kid's threatening us now." Alexandra closed her eyes, her shoulders still weighting as if she could hear something they couldn't. The townsfolk outside the station were no better. Word had spread fast in this small place, and a crowd gathered, curious and cruel. A man in a trucker hat spat on the ground as Alexandra was led out, her wrists still bound. "Delusional girl," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. A woman nearby, her purse clutched tight, whispered to her friend, "She looks homeless. Why is she pretending to be important?" Alexandra's eyes flicked toward them for a moment, sharp as a blade, before settling back on the horizon. The cops didn't notice. They were too busy laughing, one of them clapping her shoulder like she was a kid playing dress-up. "Come on, General," he mocked, dragging out the word. "Tell us about your big army." She didn't respond. Her silence was heavy like the air before a storm. "Hey, if this story's hitting you, take a second to grab your phone. Hit that button drop, a comment below. Maybe share a moment when someone underestimated you. And subscribe to the channel. It means the world to keep telling stories like this. All right, back to Alexandra. The cops decided to make a show of it. They didn't just want her gone, they wanted her humiliated. The older one, his face red from laughing, grabbed a rope from the back of a patrol car. "Let's give the town something to talk about," he said, his voice thick with smugness. They marched her to the town square, where a gnarled oak stood its branches heavy in the dusk. The crowd followed, growing louder, their whispers turning to jeers. A woman in a bright red coat, her lipstick smeared, pointed and laughed. "She's the same age as my daughter, and she thinks she's a general." The younger cop tied the rope around Alexandra's wrists, then looped it around the tree, pulling it tight. She didn't struggle. Her shoulders stayed square, her chin level. The police chief, a barrel-chested man with a permanent smirk, strolled up twirling his baton. "General, huh? At your age, you haven't even finished basic training." The crowd roared, their laughter sharp as glass. A shopkeeper, his apron stained with grease, pushed to the front of the crowd, his voice loud and mocking. "Hey, General, where's your parade?" He waved his phone, recording her, his grin wide. "This is going viral. Local girl thinks she's a war hero." The crowd laughed harder, some clapping, others shouting encouragement. A teenager in a hoodie tossed a soda can, letting it roll to a stop near Alexandra's boots. She didn't look down. Her hands tied behind her flexed once, then stilled. The shopkeeper kept filming, zooming in on her face. "Smile for the camera, sweetheart." He called, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Alexandra's eyes met his through the lens, unblinking, and he faltered, his phone dipping slightly. The crowd didn't notice their jeers growing louder, but the shopkeeper stepped back, his grin fading. A teenage boy, scrawny and wide-eyed, pushed through the crowd, staring at Alexandra's jacket. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Her insignia. It's real." The adults around him scoffed, one shoving him back. "Impossible," a man in a suit snapped. "No one's a general at 28. Alexandra's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile. She looked at the boy, her eyes steady, and said, "In 5 minutes you'll believe." The cops lost it, their laughter echoing across the square. The younger one, his face flushed, leaned close. "Fine, call your army here. We'll wait." He checked his watch, grinning like he'd already won. The crowd pressed in their phones out, snapping pictures, recording her tied to the tree like some kind of sideshow. Alexandra closed her eyes, her breath slow, her hands still. The square buzzed with anticipation, but a new voice cut through a librarian, her glasses perched on her nose, her tone sharp with superiority. "This is what happens when kids read too many books about heroes," she said, folding her arms. "She's living in a fantasy." The crowd nodded, some chuckling, others murmuring agreement. The librarian stepped closer, her eyes scanning Alexandra's plain jacket. "You should have stayed in school, not out here playing soldier." Alexandra's gaze flicked to her just for a moment, and the librarian froze, her words catching in her throat. The younger cop laughed, breaking the tension. "What's next, General? Gonna call in a tank?" Alexandra's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You'll see soon enough." The crowd jeered louder, but a few faces faltered, their laughter thinning, like they sensed something shifting. Minutes ticked by. The square was loud shouts, laughter, the hum of voices blending into a cruel hum. A woman in a floral dress, her voice dripping with fake pity, called out, "Poor thing, she really believes she's somebody." The chief tapped his baton against the tree, each thud deliberate. "If you've got troops, order them here," he barked. The crowd joined in, chanting, "Call them Little General." A young officer barely older than Alexandra stepped forward, his grin sharp. Why not scream it loud so the whole world hears? The air felt heavy now, the laughter starting to falter like they were waiting for something to break. Alexandra opened her eyes, her gaze cutting through the noise. "You've just asked for what you cannot endure," she said, her voice low, steady like a warning carved in stone. The chief froze his baton mid-air, but then he laughed harder than before, trying to shake off the chill her words left behind. A gust of wind swept through the square, rustling the leaves of the oak. A delivery driver, his cap pulled low, leaned against his van shouting, "Hey, General, where's your helicopter? Gonna fly in your troops." The crowd erupted again, some clapping, others mimicking helicopter sounds. He tossed an empty coffee cup toward the tree, letting it bounce off the trunk. Alexandra's eyes followed the cup as it rolled away, her face still, but her fingers tightened against the ropes. The driver kept going, egged on by the crowd. Maybe she's waiting for her mommy to save her. A few people hesitated, their laughter fading, but the driver didn't notice. He pulled out his phone, snapping a photo, his grin wide. Alexandra tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto his, and he stopped his phone slipping in his hand. The square grew quieter, the wind carrying a faint hum from the distance. Then it came a low rumble, like thunder rolling in from the distance. Heads turned confused. The ground trembled underfoot, and the crowd's laughter died in their throats. The sound grew louder, sharper, the roar of engines, the heavy tread of boots. Armored vehicles rolled into view, their lights cutting through the dusk. Rows of soldiers, their uniforms crisp, their faces hard, marched into the square, their steps perfectly synced. The crowd parted, stumbling back their phones, dropping to their sides. The chief's cigarette fell from his lips, smoldering on the ground. Alexandra, still tied, opened her eyes. They blazed not with anger, but with something fiercer certainty. The soldiers stopped forming ranks, their rifles glinting under the streetlights. The square was silent now, the air thick with fear. A woman in the crowd, her scarf slipping from her shoulders, clutched her daughter's hand, whispering, "This can't be real." Her voice trembled, her earlier confidence gone. She'd been one of the loudest laughing, as Alexandra was tied up, but now her face was pale, her eyes darting to the soldiers. The daughter, no older than 10, stared at Alexandra, her mouth open. Alexandra's gaze softened for a split second, meeting the girl's eyes before returning to the horizon. The woman pulled her daughter closer, stepping back, her scarf falling to the ground unnoticed. The soldiers' boots echoed a steady rhythm that drowned out the last of the crowd's murmurs. The woman's laughter, so bold before, was now a memory she wished she could erase. A policeman, his voice shaking, screamed, "Untie her!" Now, he fumbled with the rope, his hands trembling so badly he could barely grip it. Another cop, the younger one, backed away, his face pale. "No, it can't be." The chief muttered, his smirk gone, his eyes wide. The crowd was frozen, some stepping back, others staring at the ground, their earlier jeers now a bitter memory. Alexandra murmured so soft it was almost lost in the wind, "Right on time." Her voice carried no triumph, just a quiet truth, like she'd known this moment was coming all along. The soldiers stood motionless, waiting their presence, filling the square like a tide. An older man, his jacket patched at the elbows, stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands shaking as he clutched a thermos. He'd been silent until now, but his voice broke through, quivering. "I told them to stop," he said almost to himself. "I said she didn't look like a liar." No one listened. The crowd's attention was on the soldiers, but the man kept talking, his words spilling out. "Her eyes, I've seen eyes like that before. My brother was in the war." He stepped forward, then stopped his thermos, slipping from his hands, coffee spilling onto the pavement. Alexandra's gaze flicked toward him just for a moment, and he nodded like he'd been acknowledged by something greater. The soldiers' ranks tightened their presence, swallowing the square whole. A jeep screeched to a stop in front of the tree. A senior officer, his uniform heavy with medals, stepped out. He was older, his face weathered, but his salute was sharp, precise. "Reporting the entire army awaits your command, General Kane," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. The thousands of soldiers snapped to attention, their salutes echoing like a single clap of thunder. The townsfolk didn't move, didn't breathe. The chief's knees buckled, his baton clattering to the ground. Alexandra's gaze swept over the crowd, slow, deliberate, before she spoke. "Arrest them all," she said, her voice calm but final, like a door closing. The soldiers moved instantly, their boots heavy on the pavement, their hands swift as they surrounded the cops. The corrupt officers didn't fight. Their weapons hit the ground, metal clanging against stone. The younger cop, the one who'd mocked her loudest, tried to speak, his voice a stammer. "We didn't know, please." The chief was worse, collapsing to his knees, his hands raised. "Forgive us. We didn't know," he whispered, his face gray. The crowd was silent now, their heads bowed, their earlier laughter replaced by shame. The woman in the red coat clutched her purse tighter, her eyes fixed on the ground. The man in the suit who'd dismissed the boy's warning backed away, disappearing into the crowd. Alexandra stood still, her face unreadable, her presence towering even as she stayed tied to the tree. A news van pulled up at the edge of the square, its crew scrambling out, cameras rolling. A reporter, her hair perfect despite the chaos, tried to push through, her microphone raised. "General Kane, a statement," she shouted, her voice sharp with desperation. The soldiers blocked her, their faces stone, and she stumbled back, her heels catching on the pavement. The crowd watched, some whispering her name, now the word general heavy on their tongues. Alexandra didn't acknowledge the reporter. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes catching the glint of a streetlight, and the reporter froze her microphone, lowering. The soldiers' movements were precise, their hands steady as they secured the cops, the scene unfolding like a machine clicking into place. An officer, young but steady, approached with a knife. He cut the ropes, careful not to meet her eyes. The cords fell to the ground, and Alexandra stepped forward, rubbing her wrists. The officer handed her a sword, its blade catching the light. She took it, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was claiming something she'd never lost. She raised her hand and the army roared back their voices, shaking the square, the sound rolling out across the town. The crowd flinched, some stepping back, others frozen, their faces pale. Alexandra turned to the townsfolk, her eyes steady, her voice clear. Remember, it is not age that makes a general, but the army behind her. The soldier's cry rose again, louder, drowning out every whisper, every jeer, every doubt. The square grew still as the soldiers worked their efficiency, chilling. A mother in the crowd, her toddler clinging to her leg, whispered to her friend, "I laughed at her. I shouldn't have." Her voice broke and she pressed a hand to her mouth, tears welling. The toddler looked up, confused, tugging at her sleeve. Alexandra's gaze passed over them. Not lingering, but the mother flinched, stepping back into the shadows. The soldiers didn't pause, their hands quick as they loaded the cops into a vehicle. The mother's friend touched her arm, whispering, "It's okay," but the words felt hollow, lost in the weight of the moment. The square was no longer theirs. It belonged to Alexandra now. The aftermath was quiet, but it cut deep. The chief was gone by morning, his badge stripped, his name erased from the station's roster. The younger cop, the one with the lazy sneer, was fired too, his face plastered across local news sites, his mockery now a public humiliation. The woman in the red coat who'd laughed so loudly lost her sponsorship with a local boutique, her face too recognizable, her words too cruel. The man in the suit who'd scoffed at the boy found his business partners pulling away their emails, short their calls unanswered. The town didn't forget. The square, once loud with laughter, stayed quiet for weeks. The oak tree a silent reminder of what happened when you judge too quickly. The shopkeeper who'd filmed Alexandra stood outside his store the next day. His phone silent, his video deleted. Customers passed by their eyes, avoiding their whispers sharp. He'd posted the clip online thinking it'd make him famous, but the comments turned on him, calling out his cruelty. His hands shook as he locked the shop early, his apron still stained. Across town, the librarian sat at her desk, her glasses fogged with tears. She'd been so sure, so smug, but now her colleagues avoided her, their conversation stopping when she walked by. She picked up the Polaroid that had fallen from Alexandra's notebook left behind in the station and stared at it, her fingers tracing the edge. It wasn't a prop. It was real. Alexandra didn't stay to watch it unfold. She walked away that night, her boots steady on the pavement, her sword sheathed at her side. The soldiers followed their vehicles, rumbling out of town, their lights fading into the dark. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Her steps, her posture, the way she adjusted her jacket as she climbed into the Jeep. The townsfolk watched her go, some with shame, others with awe, but all with the weight of their mistake. The boy who'd spoken up, the one who'd seen her insignia, stood at the edge of the square, his hands in his pockets, his eyes bright. He'd known. And now so did everyone else. Years before, Alexandra had stood in a different kind of square, a training field, her father's voice sharp in her ears. "You don't need to shout to be heard," he'd said, his hands steady as he adjusted her uniform. She'd been 16, her hair pulled back, her boots too big. The other recruits had whispered then too, their eyes on her last name, their voices low with doubt. She'd ignored them, her focus on the drills, the orders, the weight of her family's legacy. Now in the border town, that same weight carried her forward, her father's words echoing in the way she held her head, the way she didn't flinch. The station was a mess the next day. Papers scattered, phones ringing unanswered. The clerk who'd laughed at Alexandra quit quietly, her resignation letter, short, her face unseen in town. After that, the crowd from the square didn't talk about it. Not out loud, but the story spread. Posts appeared online, grainy videos of the soldiers' arrival, of Alexandra's calm voice cutting through the chaos. Comments piled up, some angry, some apologetic, all stunned. How did we not see it? One read, "She was right there, and we missed it." The boy's words, her insignia, "It's real," became a hashtag, a quiet rebellion against the town's shame. The delivery driver, his cap now crumpled in his hands, stood outside the diner, his van impounded for unpaid tickets he couldn't explain away. He'd laughed the loudest. Thrown the coffee cup, but now his boss wouldn't look at him, his roots reassigned. He kicked at the gravel muttering, "I didn't know," but the words felt empty like the cup he'd tossed. The diner's neon sign flickered above him, the same one Alexandra had seen, and he stared at it, his face tight like he was searching for something he'd lost. The town moved on, but he didn't his mockery now, a weight he carried alone. Alexandra's name started to surface elsewhere. A news anchor mentioned it in passing, her tone careful. A local politician caught in the crowd that night issued a public apology, his voice shaky on the evening broadcast. The military issued no statement, but their silence was loud, their presence in the town enough to shift the air. People began to whisper her name differently now, not with mockery, but with respect, with questions. Who was she? How had she risen so far so young? The answers came slowly in pieces, a leaked document, a retired officer's interview, a photo of her shaking hands with a foreign leader, her face calm, her jacket plain. The husband arrived later, though no one called him that at first. He stepped out of a black SUV, his suit sharp, but understated, his face unreadable. The square was empty now, the soldiers gone, but a few stragglers lingered, their eyes wide as he walked toward the station. He didn't speak much, didn't need to. The chief, already on his knees in the aftermath, looked up and froze. The woman in the floral dress who'd mocked Alexandra's youth turned away, her hands shaking. The man in the suit, the one who'd dismissed the boy, stammered an excuse and left his car peeling out of the lot. The husband's presence was enough of his quiet authority, the way his eyes scanned the scene, the way the air shifted when he moved. He nodded to Alexandra, a small gesture, and she returned it, her face softening for the first time that night. The mother with the toddler stood outside her house that night, her daughter asleep upstairs. She stared at the oak tree in the distance, its silhouette stark against the sky. She had laughed, clapped, joined the crowd, but now her hands trembled as she clutched a cup of tea, the steam rising into the cold. Her friend had called, asking if she'd seen the news, but she couldn't answer. The toddler's drawing, a crayon sketch of a woman in a jacket, lay on the table, and she touched it, her fingers shaking. She'd been wrong, and the weight of it settled in her chest heavy as the soldier's boots had been. The town slept, but she didn't, her eyes fixed on the tree. The consequences weren't loud, but they were real. The chief's firing was official by noon, the paperwork stamped his career over. The younger cop's face, once smug, was now a meme, his words twisted into a warning: don't underestimate what you don't understand. The woman in the red coat deleted her social media, but screenshots of her laughter lived on, shared in group chats, posted on forums. The man in the suit lost a contract, his name dropped from a charity board, his absence noted at the next town meeting. The town itself changed its gossip, quieter, its judgment softer. People looked twice now, wondering who they might be dismissing, who they might be wrong about. The reporter from the news van sat in her hotel room, her laptop open, her story unwritten. She'd seen Alexandra's face, felt the weight of her gaze, and now her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure. She'd wanted to scoop a soundbite, but what she'd witnessed was bigger, heavier. She typed a single line. General Kane stood silent, and the town learned to listen, then deleted it, her hands shaking. The footage played on her screen, the soldier's salute, Alexandra's steady steps, and she closed the laptop, her reflection staring back. She'd been part of the crowd too in her own way, and now she didn't know how to tell the story. Alexandra didn't return. Her jeep rolled out of town, the soldiers behind her, their engines a low hum in the night. The square stayed empty, the oak tree standing alone, its bark scarred where the ropes had been. The boy who'd spoken up kept her insignia in his mind, sketching it later, his pencil careful, his hands steady. He didn't talk about it, but he didn't need to. The town knew. They'd seen her tied to a tree, mocked and dismissed, and they'd seen what came after. Her youth hadn't been a lie. It had been a weapon, one they'd underestimated until it was too late. The story lingered not just in the town, but beyond. It spread in quiet ways, in conversations over coffee, in posts shared late at night. People who'd never met Alexandra felt her story, felt the sting of being judged, the weight of being unseen. They saw her in their own lives, the moments they'd been dismissed, the times they'd held their ground. Her silence, her steady gaze, her single sentence that stopped a room, it stayed with them. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, about standing tall when the world tried to push you down. And for those who'd been there, who'd laughed or jeered or turned away, the memory was heavier. They saw her face in their dreams, her eyes sharp, her voice calm. They saw the soldiers, the jeeps, the swords. They saw the moment the ground shook, and they knew they'd been wrong. Not just about her, but about everything about who matters, about what strength looks like, about what it means to carry a name. You've been there, haven't you? Looked down on, counted out, told you don't belong. Alexandra stood anyway. You can too. You're not alone in this. Her story is yours in a way. Hold it close. Keep walking. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.